So welcome. So thanks for joining us. And Your Royal Highness, thank you for making yourself available to join us this evening. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So I think there's a story behind why we're here tonight, which is close to my heart. It's close to Talentmark's heart. And for those of you that don't know the business very well, I'm David Nolan, Chief Executive of Talentmark, and we're now in our 55th year in business. I guess the core thing that we do is we find gaps in the market where innovation is needed, and we work with boards, senior leaders, to bring those teams together, ultimately to get products to market, to help patients. And my team, I'm very lucky because my team are very focused on the helping patients piece, because it's not every executive search business that starts with the patient in mind and comes back to what we need to do right now to make a difference. So I will always say thank you to my team, so great to have a few of you here this evening. So this was sparked by conversations I've been having with really two people in the room. Annalisa, we talk a lot about women's health and have done for many years. Diana, we recently met and we got a conversation going at JP Morgan around what is women's health. And whilst a lot of people will put it into a box and say, well, it's products for women's health. It's actually not. Women's health affects everybody. It affects men as much as it does women. And I spent a lot of time with drug developers, focusing in on real detail, real technology to do clinical trials better. And we're missing some of the very basic stuff when we think about sex inclusion. So tonight really is devoted to two things. Barbara's going to share some data on what we're seeing in clinical trials and more broadly with data. And then we're also going to look at the investments landscape. Why is women's health underinvested in, underrepresented? I don't know the answer, because we look at lots of Me Too products in other categories that are really Me Too, very average, and loads of money flowing through. So we're going to just pose some questions around why that is. And I'm very lucky to have Annalisa, who's going to chair this evening. So Annalisa, I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and Your Royal Highness. Thank you so much for being here. I'll start by saying that Her Royal Highness is here in a personal capacity, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that in a minute. And this is the first of 3 events this evening. So she's going to be with us for an hour, and then we'll be departing. But I wanted to, by way of introducing this session, really make a comment or provide an observation on the fact that you're going to hear a lot about women's health tonight. And really the biggest question is, in my mind, with women's health, why should the world and many people around the world, particularly those with access to large amounts of capital that they wish to deploy, why should they care? And why should they be taking action? And that is a question that I think that we need to pay far more attention to and to unpack and to elevate in broader forums around the world. The second question is, who should be at the table and who should be engaging in this dialogue? And of course, we all have spent a lot of time talking about this over the years, and I often stand up in rooms on this topic, and I say to the women that are gathered, use your voices and raise your voices, but I specifically call out the men who gather, because at the end of the day, when we look at the key decision makers across our industry, and those with access to capital and those with the ability to write the checks and make the decisions, today, that largely lies in the hands of men. So we need allies, and we need to partner, and we need to educate men, and we need to engage everybody in this topic, which is what David was talking about earlier. So thank you tonight for the men who've come along to hear more about this topic. And then thirdly, in terms of the who, it's not just about the private sector, is it? It's not just about the small entrepreneurial companies, many of whom are represented here tonight. Many of you have founded and are leading those companies. It is also about the role of the government, and it's also about the role of the non-profit sector. And it's also about those who are engaging globally on this topic. So tonight, as I said, I'm particularly pleased to welcome Her Royal Highness here because of the work that she has been doing through her many patronages on this topic, and specifically some work that she has been engaging with in the last few years on gender-related violence in conflict zones. And women's health is about the health of all women, wherever they are in the world. And the fact that women can be helped by our industry and the work that the Duchess is doing at the moment relates to some really interesting technology that's being developed in Swansea as it relates to biomedical engineering and surgery to address the consequences of conflict-related gender violence. And this is just a really good example of how our innovative sector can apply itself in ways that can potentially really help to improve but also extend the lives of women living globally. I'm also thrilled to have with us tonight Jenny Halpin, who is the founder and CEO of the Lady Garden Foundation. And the Lady Garden Foundation, where I'm a trustee, I'm honoured to serve as a trustee, is an organisation that originally was raising money to support basic research around gynecological cancers, originally ovarian cancer, and now has very much expanded into the area of helping young women, and all women, but particularly young women, talk about their gynecological needs, and particularly to address the need for early prevention and early detection of the 5 most common gynecological cancers. And I think most of you in the room will know that we don't do a very good job of this. Women really aren't talking about it. They don't know much about it. And we're leaving it far too late before women are coming forward to be diagnosed and therefore be treated. And so just reminds us that we need everybody in the ecosystem to come together and address this topic. So I'm thrilled that we've managed to get this together. It'll be the first, I hope, of a number of these forums where we can start to curate a grown-up dialogue on this, and we're going to explore a little bit this evening about what that dialogue should really look like. Because for too long, women's health has really been a topic, and we're going to hear from our keynote, for too long been in the corridors where only women occupy them. And for too long has been a dialogue where I particularly over the number of years have gone into the offices of investors and said, well, I want to talk to you about vaginas, and I want to talk to you about microbiome, and I want to talk to you about vulvas. And of course, at which point they all creep into the corner and say, we really, really don't know anything about that, and we really, really don't want to talk about it. And I think the time has come for us to be a bit more grown up in that dialogue. So, and just lastly, I just wanted to say thank you before I step back down to Diana, because Diana really, really did start to spark this idea about curation. And Organon, as you know, is a very large global organization dedicated to improving and extending the lives of women and addressing women's health. And Diana leads their innovation strategy. And as she has said, she needs more innovation in the pipeline. She needs investors in the venture world, in the private equity world, to be out there funding founders, PIs, postdocs, and founders, because that is the pipeline and engine of the future of innovation and progression in our industry. So thank you to Diana. So without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Barbara. Barbara, many of you probably know because of the work that she has been doing for a number of years actually at McKinsey on this topic, producing really important papers to really expand and really help the debate on this topic. Been a partner at McKinsey for about 17 years now, I think it is, yes. and of course leads a number of the practices, particularly I think around how to think about workforce and the diversity of workforce and how that aligns with successful strategies for organizations, but also particularly is focused on the foundation at McKinsey, which focuses on health span, lifespan, and trying to help corporations think about the health and happiness and wellness of their organizations and how to think about supporting that. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I'm going to say thank you so much for coming along to share your most recent publication. And I've seen the slides and I'm really excited for you to share this with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, and it's lovely to see some gentlemen in the room. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the gap that we see in women's health, the case for funding it, and why it makes great business sense. So, without further ado, and this is the point. So I'm here on behalf of McKinsey, but also McKinsey Health Institute, which is our non-profit generating research institute, which doesn't just do the research, but it's also very focused on generating outcomes and moving people to action. And we did this research over 2 years with the World Economic Forum. So the work that you're about to see is that the output of that collaboration with the World Economic Forum. The thing that I'm going to talk about is 4 myths in the industry that we see, which we'd like to debunk. We'd also like to talk about the causes of the funding gap that we see, and also what we can do about it, which I think is the reason that we're all here. So with that, let me move ahead. So the first myth, which is women live longer than men, so therefore must be healthier. Not true, unfortunately. When you look at this, women, if you look at the number of years that women live with disability, it is significantly more, over 25% more than with men. So when we present the slide, the next natural reaction is, well, of course they live with more disability. They all live longer. Also not true. So when we have a look at actually when those years happen, it's actually during their working years. And this has a major impact on GDP. I'm going to show you in a moment the size of the gap or the opportunity that we see. It's $1 trillion in GDP. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that if we could get working women back into the workplace with better health because they're being served better, that is a large proportion of that $1 trillion gap that we see. So this is about working women as well as all women. The third myth that we see is that women's health is about sexual and reproductive health. When we looked at over 200 conditions, what we did is we looked at 200 conditions and looked at them in terms of the disability-adjusted life years. And we looked at the total proportion of global women's health burden. And what you see here is 4 categories. The first category, which you'll see in the light pink on the left, is those conditions that affect women uniquely. So they are conditions that are women-specific. But they only make up about 5% of the global burden. The second set of things that you see in the yellow are the conditions that affect women differently. And again, so things like cardiovascular disease. Those are in the light piece. The 2 biggest blocks by far are conditions that affect women disproportionately, so things like autoimmune disease, things like headache conditions or migraine. And also, over 40% are conditions for which, at the moment, we have no evidence that there is any difference between men or women in terms of how that affects them proportionately or how they should be treated in terms of care. What does this mean? So this means, as an industry, we are all, or when you look at most life sciences companies, they're all women's health companies. When we think about women's health, those sexual and reproductive conditions are hugely important, but it's taken up a huge amount of the conversation. This is about reframing women's health to show that actually a lot of the conditions affect women. So when we look, 16 out of the top 20 pharmacos actually have the majority of their revenue in conditions that are unique to women disproportionate to women or affect women differently. So they are women's health companies. That's 60% of their sales. And finally, when we look at the R&D assets, 55% of those phase 2, 3 assets are again in that proportion of conditions that either affect women uniquely, differently, or disproportionately. So this is a real reframing for the industry to say you are women's health companies. This is not a niche opportunity. What is the upside opportunity here? The upside opportunity, if we start addressing those conditions that aren't unique to women, is a huge opportunity. If you look at asthma alone, that's an additional 16 million patients that could be receiving care, which is 480,000 DALYs. Colorectal cancer, we were talking about cancers, that's an additional 325,000 DALYs that we could have. And most importantly, tuberculosis, when we look at that, that's an additional 1.3 million. These are major conditions where actually women just aren't studied today, where there's a funding gap, and this is really the call to action, which is there is huge upside from really addressing this. Which takes us to the following myth, which is somehow that we think that this is a niche opportunity. It's really not. When we look at something like endometriosis, I can never say it, it's actually 180 to 250 million opportunity. Let me just pause again and give you that again, 180 to 250 billion dollar opportunity. The only major other area that we see that comes even close to that is oncology. 1 in 10 women suffer from the condition. However, when you look at the number of assets in the pipeline against that, there are 20. When you look at another condition that affects 1 in 10 women, which is diabetes, again, you see 580 assets in the pipeline. So we see a very stark difference in that is perceived to be affecting women only versus those that actually affect women. And this is not, and I think this is a really important message, this is not about saying you should switch the funding away from diabetes. This is about increasing the size of the pie overall. This is not about reallocating the pie. And this is a call to action to say we should be funding more so that we can impact more patients over time. So what are some of the reasons that we see for this health gap? So we see these as 4 main reasons. One is actually a limited understanding of sex-based differences. When we look at clinical trials and the endpoints, only 5% of studies, when we looked at COVID, only 5% of studies, and this is true of clinical trials generally, have actually designed into it gender-based differences as part of the clinical trial and collecting that data. That's a pretty easy fix. The second is actually constrained access to sex-appropriate care, and I'll be talking about this in a bit more detail as well. The third is we see really big data gaps actually in women's health burden and them being undercounted and underrepresented, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And then I know we're going to have a very lively panel discussion, I know, on this as well, but the final one is actually those levels of investment that we see actually limiting the innovation in the space. So these are the 4 really big drivers that we see today. So given that, what is the upside case? As part of the introduction is why should we care about this? Why should we care? So the first is actually because it will make a huge impact to women. It is the right thing to do. If you look, there is 7 healthy days per woman per year that is at stake here, which equates to over 500 days in a woman's lifetime. That's nearly 2 years. But it also makes great business sense, particularly if you're a policymaker. If you go back to that chart that I showed, which talked about the number of working women, if we could have more women in better health working, that's 137 million women globally who could actually be working full-time. And we know that if they're working full-time, that gives economic growth, it means better outcomes from their children, and it means better outcomes for society. So not only is it the morally right thing to do, it's economically the smart thing to do as an economy. So with that in mind, I've managed to describe the problem. What's the blueprint, actually, for changing this? So we talk about 5 things. It's about counting women, it's about studying women, it's about caring for women, it's about including women, and it's about investing in women. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. So as we think about this, it's about making sure that actually we address some of those disparities that we talked about, because women's health outcomes are unique. It's also about studying women, as I talked about, and actually really understanding those conditions that are specific to women, but also those conditions that affect women disproportionately or differently. It's also about caring for women and seeing the differences that currently women get in care. To give you an example of this, there was a recent study in Denmark, actually, which showed that women on average get diagnosed much later for more serious conditions. For cancer, that can be up to 2.5 years. For diabetes, it can be 4.5 years. And just for a moment, I rarely talk about my personal stuff, but I will do this. You may hear from my voice, I'm actually recovered from throat cancer. I actually had cancer of the vocal cords. I got diagnosed actually only after I had finished my pregnancy and after I'd given birth to my son. Because for a year, people just assumed that I was swollen, my vocal cords were sounding wrong because I was pregnant. And I was told to wait an extra 3 months afterwards to let the swelling go down so that they could be sure that actually that it wasn't just postpartum swelling. That's an extra year that I could have got care. Now, luckily, I'm very, very lucky and I survived, but can you imagine? I am a woman who has access to great healthcare. I got to see one of the top specialists in the world. I was able to go to the US for care. Most women aren't in my position. The 4th one is really about including all women. So this is really about looking at making sure that when we run clinical trials, we look at women all over the world in terms of geographies, in terms of demographics as well. And then the final one is about investing in women, as we talked about. And we talked about having our voices heard as part of this, but also making sure that we may empower more female voices in the decision making. So within that, let's talk about counting women. And to measure is to take action. So when we looked at the conditions that impacted women, we found 9 conditions that account for about 1/3 of that health gap. And we divided these into 2 categories: those that impact your health span, so that add life to your years. So how can you live better within the time span that you have? Because they're rarely fatal. And what we found with those is they're often not even on the essential medicines list. And even when you look at migraine or PMS, only 1/3 of those are considered essential medicines. What we see is much more funding on lifespan conditions, so those that add years to life. So again, we see much more emphasis on things like breast cancer, affects mothers disproportionately, so actually it's been one that is very funded. We see it for ischemic heart disease, which, by the way, is, aside from neonatal death, the single biggest killer of women. I think people don't realize that heart disease is actually the thing that actually women die from the most. It is the most lethal condition. And then postpartum hemorrhage. So actually, I found this astonishing, that actually many of the conditions that actually affect women's day-to-day lives, as opposed to necessarily kill them, are the ones that just aren't considered essential. This is about studying women. As I explained to my husband in the cab the other day, he is not in life sciences. The way most clinical trials are run is they're run on men, there's a certain height and weight assumed, and kind of women's dosage is taken from that. So he said to me, I have a daughter as well, I said, so does this mean that actually you're overdosed most of the time? I went, yes. Women are not small men. So with that, when we actually look at this, what we see is that women's healthcare research is underfunded. When we talk about those 5% of conditions that affect women uniquely, only 1% of global healthcare research and innovation is actually invested in those. So even of those conditions, they're chronically underfunded. When you look at those that affect women disproportionately, like autoimmune diseases, 78% of Americans with autoimmune diseases are women, but only 7% of the budget is actually allocated to specific research on how it impacts women. When you look at, we talked about this in terms of heart disease, women are more likely to die in the year following a heart attack, yet only 5% of the budget actually again went on to how women specifically suffer from this. So it's not just about those diseases on the left-hand side that just uniquely affect women, but it's actually about those ones that disproportionately or affect women differently. And this is another cut on the same data. I'm going to show you several cuts of different cuts of the data, and they all tell the same story. So the first on the left shows how underfunded conditions are that affect women uniquely. This looks at the research funding, and it's not a perfect indicator, but we've looked at the total research funding relative to the disease burden to see if it's proportional or not, and created a metric which is essentially dollars per DALY to try and look at this. What you see is women's conditions are grossly underfunded. But even when we look at conditions that affect both men and women, so you'll see a very big discrepancy. So migraine disproportionately affects women. It's got roughly the same prevalence as cirrhosis of the liver, but men are twice as likely to get cirrhosis of the liver, and women are twice as likely, 2 to 3 times more likely to have migraine. Just look, there's a 10 gap differential between migraine and cirrhosis. By the way, cirrhosis, very heavily linked also to alcoholism and drinking. Migraine, not so much. When you also look at conditions affecting 1 in 10 women that I talked about, again, you see exactly the same thing that I talked about in terms of endometriosis and diabetes. Again, you see a 10-fold gap in something that affects women. So again, this is not about saying that we should be taking funding away from some disease areas. This is about just systematically addressing some of those conditions. Now, you could say that this data here doesn't actually show kind of quality of life. This really just looks at the research relative to the funding burden. Well, when we look at the conditions, and this is a very complicated chart that I'll explain in a moment, it's an even worse picture. So what you see here is the assets on the vertical axis, the assets in the pipeline. And what you see on the right-hand column here is the percentage of suffering caused by disability. So this is essentially your quality of life or your DALYs. And you'll see the dots here for different conditions. So the gray dots are those where there's no sex difference. The very sort of purpley ones are ones that affect women disproportionately. The ones that are in this kind of pale yellowy pink are those ones that are affected differently. And the blue ones are those that are male-specific, and then the pink ones are pink-specific. Actually, what you should see is the reverse of this picture. You should see those that are potentially most debilitating actually having more assets in the pipeline. We actually see the reverse picture here. What we see here is that the most debilitating conditions, so things like uterine fibrosis, dermatitis, rheumatoid arthritis, etc., are the ones that actually attract the least funding proportionally. Not true, by the way, of the 2 male conditions that we've pointed out. And I think we talked about female-specific cancers as well. And except for ovarian cancer, we actually see, again, fewer than expected assets in the pipeline. Breast cancer being a notable difference to that, but there are reasons for that. But excluding those, if we look at those, what we see is chronic underfunding of the gynecological cancers for women. So again, different cut, same data, same story. So study women. What we also see is the standard of care for women is also missing. So when we look at this, we look at clinical practice guidelines that actually met the global standards of evidence-based practice for women. And I talked a little bit about the diagnostics part of this, but this looks at a combination of diagnostics and also treatment. And again, what you see is just a chronic lack of really understanding what it is about women that is different and therefore how to treat them differently as part of clinical practice. And so what we saw is when we actually looked at the clinical practice guidelines assessed for those conditions that treat women, for women that suffer from it disproportionately or differently, again, we saw only 8% actually recognized that difference and actually covered all of those criteria. we discussed inequities. And here it's around making sure that as part of the inclusion agenda, we look at women across the globe as well. Because some of the biggest mortality rates that we see is obviously not just in the Western world. So here on the left-hand side, what you see here is we've taken cervical cancer mortality rates. And what you see is a very stark difference here around age-adjusted mortality rates for cervical cancer. Obviously, where you've got vaccines now, which are very effective in younger women, in the UK, US, we see that. Whereas actually, when you look at the global picture, it is very, very different. And so, again, what we see here is that there is a real opportunity to fundamentally improve mortality rates across the globe, particularly in countries where potentially women are undertreated and treated differently. In addition to which, even in those countries where, like the US, we actually see huge differences, actually, racially, when you look at the disparities here. So if you take your average white woman versus your non-white woman in the US, and you look at it in an age-adjusted way for mortality rates, you see double the difference here. This is a complicated picture. This is partially about treatment and clinical guidelines. But actually what we show is that there's just a very, very stark, unequal picture here. And finally, we really have the call to action around ignoring women is bad for business. So why is it bad for business? Well, we said it's not a niche opportunity. It is an absolutely huge opportunity. But not only that, women are the decision makers when it comes to healthcare spend. So when you have a look, 80% of healthcare spending decisions for people in their household are made by women. So actually addressing women, addressing their needs, building that relationship with women is just a smart thing to do as a company. The second is when you look at women, we tend to recommend as well. So when you look at the number of women, we're great influencers on others in terms of being able to recommend a treatment, being able to recommend a doctor, supporting those in our community as well. So when you have a look for a patient to come in to actually seek treatment, we see that an average woman recommends another 2.5 people for treatment. Actually, coming back to my cancer story, it was actually my husband's stepmother who said, actually, she happened to be an opera singer. She said, something's not right with your voice. I'm going to go and book you an appointment with my surgeon. I said, no. She's like, I'm going to do it. Thank you. So, I just think it just makes business sense. We did this research back in 2003, and we've continued to update and refresh it. And so we had a question actually around, what progress are we making? And so one of the things that we have created is an open access data platform that actually allows you to see how we're doing. And so what we have is there is this tracking. It is open to all of you. All of the data that I've shown is open access. It's part of our health research. You can look at it by country. You can look at it by condition. And it just also gives you a sense of kind of how much progress we're making as well. I'll leave up this final slide, which has all of the research papers on it. But the final thing I wanted to say is hopefully I've been able to dispel a few myths that we often see around the industry. I think I've hopefully been able to show you the importance of the funding gap. And if there's one message I want to leave you with, it is just that it is smart business to really invest in this and in women. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's, it always amazes me over the years that data really matters. At the end of the day, it's so wonderful when you actually have access to data because it creates transparency. It allows us to generate insights and knowledge and should be able to translate into action. So I think one of the messages here is I think many of us have been working in the industry for many, many years, have recognized over the years the challenges with being able to get women into our clinical trials. yeah, and designing clinical trials that are meaningful for women and address the needs of women, to then translate the data from the clinical trials into guidance that is applicable to women, and then in the healthcare systems to be able to have care pathways and treatment protocols that are relevant for women and are implemented. So I think, these are the areas that are very tangible and are tractable. And so I think it is all about now, what can we do and how can we, because it's all about we as individuals that work across all different parts of the ecosystem, whether it be in our industry, in the non-profit space, in public service, in government, how can we all develop a common language to try and start to address this over the coming years? So I did promise that I was going to allow the Duchess to escape from here on time, so that time has come. And we'll have the opportunity to interact with Barbara over the next 20 minutes to ask questions, and then I think we're going to convene in about 20 minutes for our panel discussion. So thank you very much, Barbara.
Pleasure.
All right, hi everyone. So I get the opportunity to kick us off at our second part of this event and introduce our esteemed panel. So I want to start with Anna Maxwell, who is the CEO and founder of Maxwellia. So Anna is really leading a revolution in over-the-counter medicine. She comes from a pharmaceutical background, and she realized the gap in the market, that a lot of things are not available in an easy way. And access really matters when it comes to women's health. So through Maxwellia, Anna made Levima, the first daily oral contraception available here in the UK, and you have 3 other products on the market that are available to women over the counter right now, and you're working on many others as well. This really matters because access is one of those big hurdles in women's health, and you can see the way the winds are blowing right now. This is becoming even more important. Next to her, we have Klaas Zuideveld, who is the CEO of Versameb, a Swiss biotech, who has an mRNA platform for muscular regeneration, and they're using this platform to address urinary stress incontinence. So this is something that affects women and has a huge impact on women's lives. And under Klaas's leadership, the company has raised 32 million euros. They are about to start phase 2, and they are a company that's looking for investors to be able to get this product to patients. So we really want to hear about how it is in the trenches. And next to him, we have another CEO. This is Kerr. She's currently the CEO of NeRRe Therapeutics. NeRRe was also co-founder and CEO of Therapeutics. Well, she started that when she was an entrepreneur residence at Advent Capital. And I would love to hear more about your story, how you pushed a drug through that addresses hot flashes in women, and that company was sold to Bayer. The phase 3 is finished, and Bayer is about to launch that in the second half of this year. That is a huge achievement. Needs to be approved. Well, sorry, it needs to be approved. Well, you can tell I'm optimistic. You can tell what I think FDA should do. Sorry. And Jane Wall, last but not least, is a managing director of BioIndustry Association here in the UK. This is UK's largest life science association with 600 members. And as you know, this is really important for biotech companies to get organized, to serve their members and expand an influence of biotech. And I know you also do a lot of things to support women entrepreneurs and CEOs. And Jane comes with loads of experience leading editorial, publishing, and consulting in other large organizations in the space, including Oxford University Press and Taylor and Francis. So I get the chance to join this esteemed panel as well. So I got a chair as well, and you know me, so I'll stop right there.
All right. So when we put this together, we talked about the importance of storytelling and how compelling storytelling can be in delivering a message. So we thought it would be fantastic to have 3 CEOs who are working in this space to tell their story and how it feels. Obviously, along with Diana, who represents a really important part of the ecosystem, which is the strategics, who are obviously leading in the space, and Jane, who is really working very, very hard to curate this dialogue and to think about how to translate that into action and outcomes. So that's what we're going to do over the next 40 minutes. I know we were due to wrap up at 7 and network, so for those of you who've got a hard stop at 7, don't worry, you can sneak out the back, but I think we ought to go for about 40 minutes, if that's okay, David. So let me start with Anna. Anna, you get to go first. The question really is, the first question is just for each one of you. You know, what have you been up to with your own companies? Just give us a little bit of a brief, perhaps a little bit of a initial flavour on how it's been.
Okay, so I'm Anna Maxwell, CEO and founder of Maxwellia, and we are widening access to medicines, and that's been a passion of mine for my entire career. I always wanted to be a pharmacist, and ended up being a buyer for Boots for many years. Whilst I was there, I presided over something called a number of things like Nurofen becoming available over the counter, things like Caniston, brands that you would be familiar with. And I presided over those when I was a buyer for Boots. Turn the clock forward, having worked sort of 30 plus years in the consumer healthcare industry, I recognised that in the noughties that innovation had really just become a trickle, and there was just nothing, what I call proper innovation. There was nothing really coming through consumer healthcare. All the big companies were doing another nasal spray or a blackcurrant flavour of something or a capsule variant, and I just got really fed up with it, to be honest. And surely life can be better than this. Consumers deserve more. And I set about banging on the doors of the big pharmaceutical companies to try and get them to do some innovation, which that fell on deaf ears. And so I decided actually to take matters into my own hands. I went on something that was akin to an MBA for entrepreneurs, wrote a book. That book became my process, and then I sat about building Maxwellia to deliver what I'd set out to achieve in the book. And that resulted in us launching the contraceptive pill, first daily contraceptive pill for women, Levima, in 2021. And that was hailed as one of the biggest revolutions in women's health. I hadn't really realised how important that was, because I'd just been basically looking at it from a practical point of view in terms of, okay, what needs to be done? This is an obvious one. It's such a pain. People access is so poor. We need to do something about it, and the impact is great. And since then, we've launched an emergency contraception that is affordable, so £12.99 instead of the 25 to 35 quid. And latterly, 2 products in period care. And period care is really important because it's 8.4 billion pounds lost to the economy every year through lost days, through periods. You know, when we look at some of the stats from Barbara as presenting, periods are just an enormous issue. So we've just launched 2 products in the period care area. One called Ivana, which is for heavy menstrual bleeding, reduces bleeding up to 60%, transformational, life-changing. That drug was reserved previously for gynecologists, but we've actually now taken it through the process from prescription, made it an over-the-counter medicine. Now it's available, and we launched our first TV ad last month on that. And also naproxen for period, so a brand called Ultravana, which is for period pain, long-lasting, superior drug for period pain. That I think if we look hard enough, probably we'll find that the molecule works better in women than it does for period pain. So I think we need to start digging. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And the way I think about what you're building is an R&D engine for consumer health, and it's really been an issue, I think, for the consumer health industry, hasn't it? Yes. To be able to access that innovation, and it's thrilling that it's being led by a woman who is trying to make sure that your product portfolio addresses the needs of all consumers, which is fantastic. It's a great story. I'm going to ask you in a minute about how the journey of financing that has felt along the way, because that's a whole other story, I think. Klaas, over to you.
Well, thank you, Klaas Zuideveld. I'm CEO at Versameb. Versameb is an RNA therapeutics company. How I got here is I was thinking about this on the way over. It's about 25 years ago. I contributed a very tiny part to erectile dysfunction therapeutics. Which some of the competitors, which at the time raised there was a tremendous amount of financing and everything else, and yet sort of a generation later, I find myself sort of struggling to find money. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. But coming back to RNA therapeutics, I worked for many years at a large pharmaceutical company who was in drug development. in the last sort of 10 years at startup companies. I came across Versameb because it was an RNA therapeutics platform, which I think was fascinating. RNA works particularly well in muscle tissue, it works well locally, and so that's how we sort of came to stress incontinence or regeneration of muscle tissue as our lead indication. Stress incontinence or stress urinary incontinence is a major indication. It affects 1 in 3 women worldwide. It starts as early as after sort of natural childbirth, but sort of carries on well into older age. It affects women, it stops them from doing activities they like, it affects them at work, it, in the worst case causes anxiety, depression. So it has really a major impact on their daily lives, and there's really no treatment today. There have been a number of attempts in the past, but nothing really, and I think that has a lot to do with how the science has evolved as well. In animals, we've actually been able to show very nicely how we can regenerate the urinary sphincter and actually regain continence, and we're looking to replicate that in humans. In a phase 2 study in the US, simply because in the US there's a little bit more experience in this space, and very actively raising financing. So happy to come back to that.
Yeah,
as well. So,
yes. And I'm so interested in this because I can't tell you the number of times in the R&D forums that I've been involved with over the last 25, 30 years where we've talked about urinary stress incontinence, only to be told by the senior leaders that there really isn't a market for it. I remember a couple of times talking about that. So it just shows you that at some point time comes and there's a moment in time. Mary, very interesting story.
Mary Kerr, I'm the CEO of NeRRe Therapeutics, which is a company focused on developing a drug for chronic cough in a rare lung condition. Probably I'm here tonight because of my experience with Candy Therapeutics, which is a company that I co-founded back in 2017. But actually Candy started in NeRRe. So that the link is that we had a pipeline of neurokinin antagonists kindly given to us by GSK. And when I started as CEO in 2016, we started looking at what should we do with this strange one that nobody's done anything with. And we have this phase 1 data, and there's some interesting signals on the GnRH pathway, and it reduces testosterone in men, and everyone's just trying to ignore that. So Mike and I started thinking, what could we do? And I listened to him talking to various scientists about the data, and I said to him, I think we've got a drug for the menopause here. And he went, yeah, maybe. Anyway, we started working this menopause idea up, got very excited about the menopause. Cut a long story short, we borrowed money because we couldn't raise money. Then we raised money. We'll come back to that. We did a small study on our borrowed money. And then we did a larger phase 2b study, and the data is incredible. This medicine that we developed from 2016 up to 2020 had a profound effect on menopausal women. It's not a hormone, it's a small tablet. It switches off a center in the brain that causes, we think, most of the symptoms. And pretty much overnight, the hot flashes, the night sweats go away, the mood improves, the quality of life improves, and the sleep improves. So we had this fabulous data in 2020, and Bayer, who are very committed to women's health, approached us and said, we're really interested. So they actually bought the drug of us in 2020. And so that was my introduction to women's health. Latterly, because I'm, like everyone here, believe that there's such a large unmet need, convinced investors who really love women's health, so you really need to speak to them, Klaas, that we should do some more target discovery. And so we've started a new company called Therapeutics. It's in stealth, which means that we're not talking widely about the work we're doing, but we're doing some early discovery work. We started that company in 2023. So yeah, very happy to be here, and yeah, hear the stories.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really inspiring. Again, menopause, we'll come back to it, but you know, one of the challenges, there are many challenges in menopause really in some ways, because not only do you have to persuade the investors that it's a good place to go and put their money, but obviously it's not always easy to define the populations, the endpoints, the regulatory science has been a bit all over the place.
We could talk about that in a minute.
Yeah,
I had lots of those conversations.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's not easy. Jane. So Jane has been leading the way in UK PLC. I asked you, and I think we were sort of exchanging emails earlier, to perhaps outline a few of the areas that you feel passionate about and that your members and the women and men actually have been talking about. And it links directly through, I think, to what we heard from Barbara earlier.
Yeah, so I'm Jane Wall. I'm Managing Director at the BioIndustry Association. We are the trade association for innovative life sciences and biotech in the UK. We represent just over 600 companies and always inspired by founders and leaders like we have on the panel here, and very proud to represent a lot of companies to government and to a broader set of stakeholders. So we do a number of things, but we work on representing. We also do a lot of work in terms of leadership development, in terms of really sort of establishing the problems that companies have. We are established to help companies start and grow in the UK, obviously always with an international outlook, but we're very focused on trying to develop, sort of that talent and that sort of, sort of commercial viability here in the UK, of which there are many challenges around that. But we're really focused, I think, through our membership on where are the real sort of problems with sort of starting and growing companies and delivering real innovation. So I was really interested to read the McKinsey report. It's really interesting to see all of that data, and I think the challenge that we have is that we've identified these sort of solutions and what we need to do, but a lot of those are really difficult, like the points around data, gathering data, that in itself, just taking that point is really complicated. There's a lack of joined up thinking in terms of data, just across the UK, let alone globally. How do we actually pull those together and also make that accessible to both researchers and SMEs in the space? The clinical trials is another area that we are sort of focused on. And again, we had a panel the other month at our Women in Biotech event, and actually, there's so much opportunity here, and it seems absolutely insane that we don't actually study the populations required in clinical trials. But there's a lot of complication around making that happen well, and how do we do that, and how do we get the money to do it as well, when money is so incredibly stretched, even more now, founders being asked to do more with their investment across sort of those kind of stages than ever. So how do we resource that kind of complexity? And women in leadership, absolutely as well, is something that we focus on a lot at BIA. I sort of lead our Women in Biotech program, so looking a lot at how do we build networks, how do we build impactful networks, how do we mentor female leaders to go on and found more and become leaders in larger organisations that are relevant globally, and how do we inspire them, to realise their potential. So yes, all of those things. Funding as well is something that we focus on a lot at BIA, both in terms of sort of non-dilutive. I know we've got Innovate here, very important, but also how do we get the venture, but also those larger pots of money that are really important to take companies forward to the next stages. So very focused on that too. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thanks, Jane. Really important, and as I say, really thank you for spearheading this. And I think there's been quite a lot of gathering momentum, really, hasn't there, in the last few years, actually, on this topic. Diana, obviously we heard some very compelling cases, a very compelling case and data for the opportunity here from a commercial point of view. So perhaps, from where you sit in the system, you could perhaps just help us understand why Organon really cares about this and what you guys are up to.
Yes, so Organon is the only company our size or bigger that has women's health in both mission and vision statement. And so we really have focused on this. We spun out 3 years ago, and with help of McKinsey and some other work and the portfolio that we brought over from MSD, we recognize that this is a huge opportunity. But what we also realized is there's a huge hurdle, because what we didn't bring with us is R&D. So we do have a little bit of R&D, and that is through acquisition, which really means what we're incredibly dependent on for this opportunity that we see, and you heard the opportunity, so I don't need to tell you that again, is we need you in the ecosystem to bring that to us. So, and what I want to do, when I kind of want to say, I represent the industry here, if I can, Organon, but also pharma industry, I think what you heard from McKinsey is that if you're in the industry, you're in women's health, it is a huge opportunity. It's not just Organon, it's everybody else. So if you're in industry, you need to ask for this when you meet with the entrepreneurs and your BD teams. But if you're an entrepreneur, you need to remind them that this is how it is. A lot of you, maybe you hear this for the first time. We live it, we believe it, and this is why we're out here telling the ecosystem there needs to be an innovation push and a market pull. And pharma really sits at the intersection of that, but everybody else matters. So that's how we think about it. We think about actually creating these ecosystems for us because we see these opportunities. We need the innovation to come from the biotech community, but we also see that we're not going to get there alone, firstly not because of we need R&D, but also because we need other pharmas to get involved, because that's where you create momentum, and that's where what we right now have is a negative spiral. We have lack of academic research, funding, pharma uptake, reimbursement, et cetera. We can talk about those points, but it's sort of a negative spiral. When everybody comes together, it becomes a positive spiral, and the market is indisputable. I mean, I thought that presentation was spot on. I'm speechless. I can't say it any better, so I won't repeat it.
I think that last point's really interesting, and if you reflect a little bit over the last 30 years, capital, the market actually is very interesting. It's a voting mechanism. I mean, the market votes what it likes, but it's not always that clever. So at the end of the day, it's remarkable in some ways that over the years, of course, money it floods into cancer. It's clearly not really that rational to have 300 or 400 programs and companies funded all looking at a PD-1. If you took a step back, you'd think, well, sort of not rational really type thing. And also that there were these large pockets of opportunity that have been ignored. And this is essentially what we're talking about. But I'm hopeful, because I think this is a really important point. I'm hopeful because, it was only 15 years ago where, again, if you went up into an R&D leadership forum and then you had the commercial people there and said, I want to do a drug for obesity, they would laugh you out of the room and say, it's not a condition, it's a lifestyle choice, and it's absolutely not a commercial opportunity. I mean, I can tell you, again, at Bristol Myers Squibb, we had 2 goes. We did a CB1 and we had a couple of others, and it was impossible. And we now know where we are today, all right? So it does tell us that our industry can evolve and change, and it's your point that what you sort of need is a movement. You need 1 or 2 to be really successful. And then what the market does is it sort of just moves over into that space. And it's not about making choices, it's about evolving sequentially capital allocation. So I actually think that your point that you just made, which is not just Organon on its own, it has to be a broad base of R&D leaders and commercial leaders that start to understand this.
Yeah, and it's not just obesity. There's several other therapeutic areas where we've seen. So nephrology, for example, when I was at KZ, there was nothing, but because of some regulatory and pricing changes, we see a lot of innovation. So there's this can change, right? This has changed.
It can change.
It can change.
It can. I'd like to turn a little bit now to what it has felt like on the journey for the CEOs in terms of what's been tough and what gives you hope for the future. Anna. And I'll just start by saying I had a discussion with Anna the other day, and I said to her, she came because they're raising a bit of money at the moment, and she said, I want to raise 3 million. And I said to her, but what if I said to you, you could have 30 million? Because it's a bit British, to say I'm going to raise 3 million. And she got all excited. And of course, because she's brilliant, she said, I've got 100 ideas or 300 ideas about what I would do to spend 30 million. And I said to her, well, go and ask for 30 million. But of course, the reality on the ground is different.
Sure.
So why don't you explain why?
So I bootstrapped the company for a number of years, but realised that I wasn't going to get very far on my own funds. And I'm delighted to say that the first person that believed in me is Natalie Douglas, who's just sitting just there. So I decided I needed investment, and I started with angel investment, and then very quickly that enabled us to start to get some VC money. I've raised just over 10 million to date, and 1.5 million of that it was a media for equity swap with Channel 4 Ventures, which was quite revolutionary in its time, to enable us to get our products onto TV. The funding journey is really, really tough. I mean, as you know, female founders only get 2% of all the capital globally. So the odds are stacked against you 98%. And for me, it's almost a full-time job. I spend probably 85% of my time actually fundraising, going around kissing frogs. And in the last just to give you context, in the last year, myself and CFO have actually targeted over 170 funds, and we are still we're still in discussions with some, but you really end up with like a handful of potential opportunities, and we have basically relied upon our existing investors. We have a very high net worth who has followed on numerous occasions, and also one of the local funds as well. But that comes with its penalties, because the market is really tough, and therefore the venture people do really, really hard deals. And so that's quite soul destroying when someone, you've worked and achieved all your milestones, and then someone tells you your business is worth half what it was before. But that kind of goes on, and I think that is quite soul destroying. But it's a fact of life, really. So you have to weave and duck and dive and try and overcome those sorts of situations. But what gives me hope is I just know that I'm actually doing something that's really making an impact, and so that's what keeps me going. I gave you the stat about the period market, but and I actually think that what needs to happen is that people need to think more about the impact that the work that we're doing actually has, because it shows up somewhere else. It may not necessarily show up in your P&L, but it's the human piece in terms of what we're actually doing in the world. So I kind of have an incredible resilience that keeps me bouncing back. And at the end of the day, I followed on. I'm one of the 2%, but the stats for follow-on female founders are even lower, and we've actually raised 3 times now. I'd like to. Our main problem has always been that I think we're an outlier. So we were an R&D business. We're now an R&D business that's commercializing. And actually, that's the experiment. That's the clinical trial. It's, can we switch these drugs to prescription, from prescription status to non-prescription status, and then can we commercialize them? And that commercialization piece takes money. That's where we need the £40 million. But in my world, no one does that. So you're left with the VCs who have ticket sizes of 50, 500 to a million. In your world, that would be, there are plenty of businesses that will, plenty of private equity that will do 50 million ticket. But in my world, actually, the five doesn't exist. So you end up then having to piece together 4 VCs, and then everyone complains that you've got a messy cap table. Yes. So you can't really win. So I just keep going. I just keep going and going and going. Like, say yes to everything. Just keep going, because I just know that our work's really important, and we have to do it. It's very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful, very inspiring. Klaas,
your
story.
I think it's very similar in many ways. I think you said something very interesting. You have to be incredibly resilient, because you're going to get beaten down almost every day. So we've raised a little bit more. We raised over time about 32.5 million. Of course, we developed a platform, did lots of pharmacology and talks and CMC. What we're finding is that I think our last funding round back in 2022, early 2023 was already, we raised less than we wanted to. It became a lot more difficult to gain traction. And in particular nowadays, I think investors want to see more advanced data, want to see clinical data. And then I think women's health and in the space we're in, urology, are just not very sexy. I mean, I think that's the one thing people will typically tell you. It's not life-threatening. There's no market. How are you going to sell this? How is it going to get reimbursed? So we've done lots of little steps. We're saying, well, we'd have reimbursement data. We actually know, many countries are willing to pay for this. But it remains very challenging, and I think it reflects to some extent. We've also, some of our earliest investors have also been family offices because that just seems easier. I do think you run into a wall at some point because they cannot continue to invest. Plus, it's for family offices a little bit more difficult to actually get traction with other investors, which for institutionals is a little bit easier. But compared to, I've worked at some other companies. This is the first company as CEO, but other companies, it's been a lot easier to raise financing for rare diseases, for oncology. Women's health is really, really tough. Yeah. So.
Mary.
Yeah, I would say, it's better than it was.
Yes.
It's definitely better than it was. But certainly when I was raising money in 2016, I'd literally just left GSK, very excited to go to biotech, was thrilled by the opportunity of the menopause. I just thought, I can't believe how amazing this would be. I talked myself into this. This is just going to be an incredible drug. And went out there with my co-founder, Mike Trower, who was the scientist, and nobody was interested. And you think, it's the menopause, it's non-hormonal, it's a small molecule. It's like, there's no market. There's no market, half the world's women, and, they were told in 2002 that HRT caused breast cancer and cardiovascular risk, and, and there's been no new innovation since, and this is 14 years later, and women don't want to take HRT. That wasn't correct, but, so there's no market. No, there's no market. There's no unmet need. There's no market. I'd have to break my partner's arm, to twist his arm off to make him do this. So, I was actually at best shocked by the reaction, and at worst completely horrified that, having only spoken to 50 VCs, big ones who had big tickets, you're talking about put 10 million in each or whatever, that there was no interest. And so we had to give up. In the end, we wanted to do this small study. Advent Life Sciences lent us 3 million. Yes, Raj and Shazad and Kazim lent us 3 million because they believed. And I said, we'll change tack. We will raise money on another indication, which is chronic cough. Someone had just got an exit, so everyone was excited about that. It's a fear of missing out. It's the fashion. We all chase after the exits. So they all chase. So we managed to raise money on cough and said, the only reason you can only come in if you're prepared to pay the loan off, and then you're prepared to let us demerge this asset into a women's health company. So that's what we did. But it was pretty shocking. But I think now it's better. It's slightly better. The base is very low, as you illustrated in your amazing talk. Thank you, Barbara. The base is so low that, you talk about 200 and 300% increase on not much. So it's a large growth on a very small base, but nonetheless, you see signs of hope. I was at an endometriosis meeting recently in Dundee, an academic meeting, and there were 4 VCs there. I was like, wow, this is good. 4 VCs. And then, and we've had a couple of deals recently in women's health. We've had we've had financing of 75 million, 30 million. Jacenta got for endometriosis with their novel target, Comanche with their preeclampsia target. So, this is fantastic. This wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. So you see some very learned VCs who really get it. I'm working with some of them. They really believe in women's health. They really get it. They see the untapped need, and they know that the minute the switch goes on with pharma, and pharma who are in the know, who think about population treatment, not just, tiny niches, but they think about, she's a woman of a certain age, she's got all these issues, how do we, conflate them all together and think about her holistically? And there are companies who do that. The minute that button is switched on, then, the floodgate will open. It will. So we see really great signs of hope and light, but it's still very early days. And but it's much better than it was.
It's interesting, actually. Thank you, Mary. If we think about what you guys represent, so you've got pelvic pain, essentially, and we talk about endometriosis, but essentially period pain is, it's all sort of wrapped around in a similar syndrome. We've got urinary incontinence, and we've talked about menopause. And isn't it fascinating that all three of you have indicated how challenging it is to get access to good quality capital? And again, it's just quite remarkable if you think about the number of people out there across just those three, as in essentially 50% of the world's population, interestingly, because 50% of the world's population are basically covered by those three areas. And yet we don't see yet the volume of capital flowing that we need. But you're quite right. I think once you start to see a few successes, that's what I mean. It's herd mentality.
Yeah, no,
It'll
definitely
start to flow through.
I mean, that's what we hoped for the Candy deal, that it's actually being used. And I've spoken to people involved in some of this financing, and they use a reference, and we need successes. And unfortunately, it's funded by investors who have to return money to their people who invest, their LPs, and so we need to show success for them. But through that success, women will benefit.
Yeah.
Everyone benefits. So we need successes in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jane, we talked at the conference about allies, didn't we? And we talked about how we needed to, and perhaps the role of bio, to be able to start to share this from your platform. Particularly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, but also, is there, do you think, a role for government in this? And if so, what is it? Because that's always been a bit of a question.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting, the discussion around, I mean, let's face it, sort of across biotech funding is pretty difficult right now, right? It's not, this is it's particularly hard right now. But I think you're right in that what you see is I think if what we can do is showcase the success, if we can showcase, these kind of innovations coming through and jump up and down about them a bit more, which we probably don't do enough of, then that will help, I think, to start, to open the floodgates and for people to recognise. Because for me, it's insane that, you sit here and say there are people who don't understand the benefits of treating the menopause. I mean, it's a crazy concept, really. But I think it goes to who's in charge. To your point previously, Annalisa, in terms of the large capital, I think that perhaps needs to move. So I think there's a role. I mean, I'm sure there is a role for government here. I mean, I think to the point that was made earlier, in terms of the impact on workforce, just generally across the piece, there has to be a point there to be made, that if you can get the, whatever percentage of the workforce working better and for longer, then that's got to be good for the country. So that's a very straightforward argument to make. There is also, that in terms of funding companies in the first place, in terms of the non-dilutive funding and focusing on some of these conditions from a non-dilutive perspective, I think there's definitely a role to play there for key organisations. So there's a range of things, but I do think that ultimately, when you think about, a lot of this comes back to influencing investors and influencing the LPs and the larger sort of capital as well. I think I think when you look at private organisations, private companies, and the way that biotechs work, the influence and the pressures definitely sort of come from there in an overarching sense.
I agree with that, and the reason I ask the question of government is because the government does take a lot of our tax and redirect it through UKRI and other macro sort of organisations, and so I wonder how much, and I know there is a gender lens to a certain extent, but again, to be able to surface that and tell that story and to make sure that that's highly effective and it's being allocated in a way. Not that I'm advocating that everyone should go out and seek government money for funding, because that has its own sort of, it comes with its own consequences, as it were. But I'm going to come to you, Klaas, actually. But I was just going to point out that in the audience today we have Ava, who's the founder CEO of the Conduit Connect, and it was about 7 years ago, I chair it, it was about 7 years ago when we were talking to family offices, slightly before Conduit, wasn't it? Do you remember that? And we were talking to big networks of family offices and asking them about whether they applied a gender lens. We had that, yeah. A gender lens to their investing, particularly next-gen family offices, where a lot of the money is sitting in the hands of the women, the next generation. And what was interesting was that they all said, yes, it's important, and yes, we really think it's something that we want to do, but many of them just didn't know how to do it. They just couldn't work through that. So I think it just gives us a sense that there is a desire out there, but we've just got to go out and try and help to educate people around gender lens investing. So Klaas, did you want to make a point? I'm going to come to you then, Diana.
No, I just wanted to tag on the government question.
Yes.
I mean, rather than giving money, into this field, I think you could also incentivize, biotechs and others by. I mean, we've been here before.
Yes.
With sort of pediatrics, where you give, priority review vouchers or extension of your marketing authorization.
Yes. Yes, that's good. It's the push and the pull. Yeah. Diana, I'm a bit conscious of the time, but I was really interested because one of the themes that has come through a lot today is around people really understanding the market and getting comfortable with the market and the opportunity. And we haven't talked a lot today about women themselves and how women are ultimately the customer and consumer, and how at Organon, I'm always interested to think about a company like Organon, where your entire world every day is to think about women as the consumer and the customer. Do you think that means that the people in your organization have different skill sets and think about the world in a different way compared to sort of a standard pharmaceutical company with their commercial department that have grown up basically in oncology, cardiovascular disease, etc.?
Yeah, we do, and you must know that as well from Merck, right? We have MSL, so and those that are more patient-facing and physician-facing, they do, and we see this every day. We see the difficulty we have reaching patients because patients themselves don't come in. So that's another group of, if you leave this room with any messages, please, speak up for yourselves, because that's also a feedback how we can get innovation to the patient. That is very true, that we do have, it's not only the reimbursement, so pricing and market access that is a hurdle, it's also patients themselves. So I think we do ourselves. So there's a huge movement there that we have, direct to consumer, not what you're doing, but these apps that talk about, menstrual tracking, or here's a group, app for PCOS. Part of me as a scientist has a problem with that, because what am I supposed to do with all these PCOS patients on a group, because there's nothing for PCOS and we don't even have a pipeline. But the other part of that is actually what you just said, is actually pulling these patients together and saying there is a market. And I do want to just, maybe last thing I want to make a point here is that, so before joining Organon, I worked for Nova Holdings, which is the largest venture capital firm in life sciences. What I learned there is we never looked at markets. I never did a single NPV analysis, and I come from banking, so I never did an NPV analysis. We invested in medical need. We figured that the market, so there's regulatory hurdles, there's all sorts of, this is biotech, there's hurdles all the way, that's the name of the game. But if there was a medical need, we would work back from that, and we would spend a lot of time niching the patient and profiling the patient. So we actually did investments in nephrology way before nephrology FDA issues were resolved. So there were regulatory hurdles, and these trials were large, and they're no longer large. But we just looked at the medical need. So I think if you can talk, if you can get a patient voice through, there are pockets of players in the ecosystem that just follow that and go by patient need and medical need.
Yeah, no. So I think we are coming to the end of our time, aren't we? I'm looking at David, because we were supposed to finish at 7, and I'm eating into your food and wine, and probably the next the next event. But I wanted to say I hope that you enjoyed that and it's helped you. Hopefully it's helped you again think through from where you sit in the ecosystem, how you might take some actions individually or participate in these dialogues, because I think that's the way it's going to move forward. And also, it's great to hear, I think, the optimism that is, I think, shared by the panel, that this is going to move forward. I personally, the reason I'm so optimistic is because I do now think that technology and digital and social media is putting a lot more power into the information, knowledge, into the hands of women. And that women, therefore, could and should be able to access and to be able to, not access, but to be able to raise their voices and to be able to start to educate the system, whether it be their employers, whether it be their doctors, whether it be whoever in the ecosystem, about their needs and how their lives are being impacted by the conditions that we've heard about. And I think that will be hugely powerful to those who have capital and are thinking about how to deploy that. So that's why I feel very, very enthused. And I just wanted to say thank you to our wonderful panel for taking your time to come here this evening and sharing your stories. Thank you.